When we left off last time, I'd managed to piece together the beautiful Vespid Models Tiger 1 and applied a layer of primer to the model. It was now ready to paint, with the challenge now being painting a 3-tone camouflage on such a small model, and then how I'd go about weathering it with that scale in mind. Today I'll take you through the steps I took so you can learn the techniques to apply to your own models. As you may recall from the last video, I'd built the model in such a way that allowed me to remove the track assemblies and treat them as a standalone part. This would make the painting and weathering step a little more user-friendly and ensure I had suitable access to these elements. A 50-50 mix of dark iron and gunmetal was used as my track colour. This is a new mix for me and I was quite happy with the finished colour. In saying that though, most of this colour would be lost under layers of weathering, so the colour at this stage is relatively unimportant, it's just a foundation to build from. Dark yellow 2 is next up, and it is the predominant colour for these 3-tone German schemes. I chose Tamiya XF88 Dark 2 because it is lighter than their standard dark yellow, and as a general rule I try to paint these smaller scales a couple of shades lighter than usual to compensate for the scale. I just sprayed the track colour, so I now carefully filled in the centres of the wheels using this dark yellow mix. The paint was thinned at about a 60-40 ratio of thinner to paint, and the air pressure was kept around 12 psi. This should help with controlling the paint application and cut down on any overspray. I got the feel for the paint flow on the inner faces of the wheels, and once I was confident, I moved to the front faces and painted them in. The dark yellow is applied over the black base in a random modelled way until the model has been covered. The benefit of painting using a black base is I can create interesting tones and variation in the finish, which will in turn give me a far more interesting model. By starting on the underside, I can quickly gauge how the look of the paint is presenting and if I'll need to adjust my thinning ratios in order for the paint to present properly. Thinning the paint more will tend to make the paint more translucent, which will deepen the tone when painting over the black base. It's about finding that balance that allows you to spray freely and gives you the tones and the colours you're looking for. Once I'm happy with the look, I can flip the model over and start the application over the top side. Like in most of these applications, I'm keeping the airbrush moving and building up the colour in random mottled tones. It's a little trickier on a model of this size because it doesn't take much paint to cover the working area. As you will see, control will be a common theme during this build and is crucial, particularly when working in these small scales. I'm treating each panel or defined area as its own entity and trying to build the colour up in that way. By doing that, it's given the model a sense of volume and scale, or at least that is my hope. I don't know what it is, but there's something satisfying about painting the turret. I'm treating those big sweeping curves on the sides as one section and painting that as such. Same theory with the stowage bin at the rear of the turret. Then to one of my favourite steps, and that is the highlighting. The dark yellow is lightened using white and a round of highlights is applied. Here I'm focusing on horizontal areas and the leading edges of the panels, however I'm keeping my coverage in a small area. Highlighting like this is designed to simulate fading and general wear, but more than just that, it's adding a visual volume to the model and helps it present larger than it actually is. You can clearly see the depth in the colour when the highlights are going down. It's not only a great deal of fun, I think it looks awesome and really makes a big difference to the model. The highlight layer is then applied to the horizontal surfaces of the hull and around any leading edges or sections that may naturally catch the light. It is a stylized approach to the paintwork, but it's a powerful technique in the toolkit, especially on a model of this size. It's then time for the part that scares a lot of people, and that is the freehanding of the camouflage pattern. I tested the paint flow and the way the airbrush felt in my hand on a piece of paper towel, and once satisfied, I committed to the scheme on the model. I started painting the wheels first because if anything was to go wrong with the paint, it would be easier to fix or hide in this location. Things were going well, so I moved on to the hull. I kept the instruction sheet under the area I was working on to serve as a visual template for me to try and follow. I try to pick a starting and finishing point on the shapes of the tank to guide me where the shapes and the lines should sit on it. It's then a matter of carefully pulling back the trigger on the airbrush and releasing a small amount of paint. I first draw the shapes of the colour block and then go back in and fill it all in. It doesn't have to be perfect, in fact it will make for a more interesting model if it isn't. The two most important things when spraying a scheme like this are your thinning ratios and your air pressure. Thinning ratios will vary depending on what paint you are using and often the environment in which you're spraying in. However, today I'm using this Tamiya acrylic lacquer, the dark green, and it's thinned at about a 70-30 thinner to paint ratio. I'm thinning using a Tamiya retarder thinner, that's the one with the yellow cap, and my air pressure is dialed in at around 12 psi. The worst thing you can do is try to dump a volume of paint and think you'll get your shapes down in that way in one go. You surrender all control trying to do that, and this application needs to be measured and purposeful. Control is the key. Be the tortoise, not the hare.
I'm more tortoise than hare.
I now move to the red brown and enhance the scheme with touches of that colour. I actually have a form of colour blindness, so I always find using these reds and greens together a little challenging. Just a reminder, if you're enjoying the content, please remember to hit that like button, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It helps me reach a greater audience and keep bringing you this content on a regular basis. With the camouflage scheme in place, I now move to my acrylic paint and look to brush paint some of the details around the model. Acrylics are water-based and are perfectly suited to brush painting. The tow cables, hoses, and tools around the model add points of difference from the yellow. Often these cables and tools were painted over by the crews, so painting them the way I do is probably more about creating an interesting model more than being completely accurate. When brush painting such fine details, I find the angle you work at is really important, and I'm constantly rotating and moving the model to find the best working angle for any given part. And then back to the tracks, and it was time to paint the rubber sections on the road wheels. Vallejo black grey and a fine brush was used to carefully hand paint them in, and the black immediately tied up any yellow overspray and brought those track assemblies back to life. It was now time for decals, so the model received an all-over SMS high gloss varnish. The high gloss finish will give the decals the ideal surface to settle over and will help avoid any silvering in them. I focused the application on the areas I knew were getting the decals, however the whole model still received at least a light coat of the varnish. The small decal sheet gives you a few options, so I removed the decals I needed and put the first one in some warm water to release it. It became obvious very quickly that these decals were some of the thinnest I've ever seen and were going to require a little more care than normal. Firstly, they were releasing after only about 10 seconds in the water, and secondly, the first one kept folding over and became unusable. Luckily there were 3 turret numbers on the sheet I had and I only needed 2, so the failure didn't knock me over, but it gave me a warning I needed to up my game. By carefully sliding the decal off the carrier sheet, I was able to get it in place in one piece. But once in place, they were incredibly tricky to move around and make fine adjustments to those positions. In saying that, the decals were probably the best looking decals I've seen in a very long time. Just be warned, because they are very unforgiving. After the decals had set, the model received a coat of, to me, a semi-gloss clear to set them in place, and now I could move on to my oil paints. A pin wash is such an enjoyable step in the weathering process, and one of the easiest techniques that all modelers can embrace. I'm using an industrial earth and a shadow brown oil paint, and I make my own wash by mixing a small blob of the paint with white spirit. The wash is first tested on the wheel sections, and if the mix is too thin, it will look too watery and transparent. If it's not thin enough, it won't run through the crevices properly. So there is a bit of a balancing act to find the sweet spot with your mix. Details around the model are then treated to the oil wash. That's a matter of simply touching the tip of the brush against the part, and I'm able to get that oil wash to run around those recesses and shapes. By using the industrial earth along with the shadow brown, I'm able to create variations in the wash colours at this stage. I'm using oil paints for the wash layer because they tend to dry softer than the enamels do. I figured, being a 72nd scale model, I wanted the wash to blend and integrate in a subtle way rather than being too pronounced. I also meant to mention too, it's always a good idea to lightly coat the part that you are wanting to put the wash on in white spirit before you start the application. By doing that, I'm able to prepare and break the surface tension, which will allow the wash to flow far more smoothly around the parts. The turret then receives the pin wash as the hull section did just moments ago. The next step is another little shortcut I've come up with and can be used at this stage. Usually a pin wash would be carefully tidied up with a brush or possibly a cotton bud, but I find if I use a brush moistened with white spirit and drag it in a downward motion, I'm able to clean up the wash, but I'm also able to create some subtle streaking and almost add a filter over the paintwork. Have to remember we're working at a small scale here, so I'm looking to keep everything refined and subtle. I've kept the underside streaking purposely heavy due to the fact that this would suffer the most weathering in real life, but in reality it'll soon be covered over with future weathering layers. Although I could have probably left it at this stage and it would have been adequate. I've seen a lot of armour modelers freeze at this point because it looks really cool with the scheme in place and the washes down, and there's that fear factor of wrecking it if you went any further. Let me know in the comments below if this sounds familiar to you, but I must press on. I'd been looking for an excuse to try these VMS Alkyd binders, and from what I understand, the binders are a slow drying pigment binder that affords you a window of time to manipulate the pigment before it sets in place. I made a paste using Vallejo Sienna pigment powder and the Alkyd binder. The paste is then painted in and around the recesses and wheel hubs behind where the running gear will sit, as well as along some of the underside of the model. A hairdryer is a handy tool and speeds up the drying process with this paste, and it gives you a good look at the effect almost immediately. I'm then able to go back with a touch of white spirit on a brush and refine the effect. I'm able to move the clumps of dirt around with the tip of the brush and help better present that weathered area. The paste is then applied to the tracks and the running gear. I can slap it on in a reasonably careless fashion because the product will allow me to remove it and refine it with just a touch of white spirit. Once the paste had dried with the aid of the hairdryer again, I can then go back with a stiff brush and chip and flake the muddy deposits off the tracks, just like it would happen with the real thing. I'm then able to use the VMS pigment jockey diluted with white spirit as a wash of sorts. I'm purposely going for that staggered, broken application to try and simulate some of the various tones and colours you'd find in a real world scenario. The light colour of the pigment jockey not only works in harmony with the darker tones from the pigment paste, but it adds another binding agent to help settle the pigment in place on the model. For the leading edges of the tracks, I found the quickest way to polish them up was to dip the tip of my finger in an aluminium paint and run it across the tops of the tracks. I'd usually use a graphite stick or pigment powder for this process, but these techniques were not presenting well on the small scale track. The bright aluminium gave the tiny edges the spark they needed. I'd used the pigment jockey products on the tracks, so it would only make sense that these colours should be integrated into the body of the tank as well. I did a full review of the VMS pigment jockey line, and I'd urge you to check it out because I've managed to get a good deal for you if you'd like to try it for yourself. I'll put the link in the video in the notes below, but essentially pigment jockey is an enamel based paint that is perfect for this type of weathering effects. I first brush painted along the lower edges of the model, with the focus being towards the rear of the shapes. Because it is an enamel paint, I'm then able to reactivate it with a touch of white spirit on a flat brush and blend it in an up and down motion using that brush. Because the paint has a high pigment content, it can often present darker when it's wet, so by quickly drying it off with a hairdryer, it gives me a clearer look at the colours and tones and an understanding of what they will truly look like. I'm then able to go back through and add even more of that light earth colour, but in a smaller area of application in order to build up the opacity of the colour in those areas. I can then use the same technique, but this time with the dark earth pigment jockey. I'm again applying this over a reduced surface area in order to create depth in the dust and dirt effects. A combination of the two colours is then integrated around the wheels. I am keeping the paint wet and allowing it to blend and merge together. The effect is further enhanced by loading a brush with the light earth colour and flicking it against a toothpick or an airbrush needle. The effect creates realistic looking splash effects, but it also helps tie the previous steps together with the model. Again, I have another video covering some of these techniques in greater depth, so I'd urge you to check them out. I'm applying it all over, however I'm focusing the heaviest application toward the rear of the vehicle. I felt the shiny tips of the tracks were a little too bright, so an easy way to tone that down was to apply the dark earth pigment jockey as a wash. The aluminium colour remained, however the dark earth wash just took the edge off that shine. And as a final step in this dusting phase, a conservative amount of dry pigment is tapped against the lower sections of the model. The dry pigment can be a little unstable at this point, but the technique gives me a gritty and textural finish in these areas. I then give the model an all-over VMS matte varnish to seal everything in place. As you can see in the video, the varnish is so forgiving and a joy to use. I literally can flood the surface without fear of damaging it. The graphite stick is then used to polish the machine gun barrel, as well as the tow cables and some of the other tools around the model. It's now a matter of tying up some of these loose ends, and I address the spare tracks now. The piece was painted at the same time as I painted the tracks, but I wanted to present this section in a semi-rusted appearance to add some interest to the front of the model. I used the rust tone pigment jockey enamels here, and I picked out individual track links to help differentiate them. I then applied the splattering technique with the lightest colour of the rust to further enhance the effect. The spare track section could now be set in place. The same paints were used for the exhausts, only this time it was more about allowing them to blend and work in unison. I focused the darker colours towards the bottom of the shapes and the lighter colours to the top to simulate newer rust tones. And in one last attempt to squeeze all the life out of this model I could, I moved back to my oils to create an even greater contrast around some of the shadowed areas and the highlights. The buff, as well as a colour called Fading for German 3-tone, original I know, are first applied in small dots to the surface and then dry blended over the paintwork. The result is subtle, but it will add more highlights to those yellows. The industrial earth is used around the shadowed areas and blended into the paintwork in a similar manner. The matte varnish I'd applied earlier really grabs onto that oil paint and helps execute this technique. Another oil I seem to go back to often is bitumen, or bitumen if you like. It perfectly simulates stains and spills when it's applied in this dappled, diluted way. It also works beautifully around the road wheels to present leaking grease and staining in those areas, and it has a slight gloss finish to it at times as well. And with that done, I think I've taken this tiny tiger about as far as I can. I seem to do it every time I take on a 72nd scale kit, and that is underestimate the time and work that goes into them. Yes, the working palette is smaller, but that can often slow the process due to the extra thought and care required in the execution of some of these effects. This tiger was no exception. I originally planned to have the model built, painted and weathered for one video, but clearly that was a little ambitious. As for this Vespid Models Tiger, as you can see, it is a seriously lovely little kit and really delivers the detail and the build experience you'd expect in a 35th scale model. Yes, there are some small pieces that won't appeal to everyone, but if you're interested in the subject and the scale, then this kit is a must-have. It is simply beautiful. If you're going to build one 72nd scale tank in your lifetime, this could be the one. Painting and weathering in the smaller scale just takes a little refinement and a little fine tuning of your techniques. Remember your thinning ratios and air pressures, and to build the shapes of the scheme up over time. Well, it's getting close to the end of the year, but I think I've got one more video in me for this year, so join me next week and I'll look to incorporate this tiny tiger into a small vignette. Remember guys, this truly is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family, share it with your friends, and be proud of what you do. Until next time, I'll see you soon.
You tiny.